on the death of the terminally ill, euthanasia. Because of a loss of faith in God and no faith in the future life, modern society has fallen into two extremes with respect to the question of death. One extreme is evidenced in the endless and senseless extending of life of the terminally ill. The other extreme, which is even more horrible and blasphemous, and yet is becoming more popular and gaining greater coverage in the press, is the alternative of a painless suicide for the aged and terminally ill. In order to illustrate the second extreme, we offer an account which was published in March of 1991, an issue of the New England Journal of Medicine. The author of the article, Dr. Timothy E. Quill, practices in Rochester, New York Hospital. The title of the article is A Case of Individualized Decision-Making. This is a synopsis of the article. Diane was feeling tired and had a rash, a common scenario, though there was something subliminally worrisome that prompted her to check her blood count. I wanted it to be viral, trying to deny what was staring me in the face. Perhaps in a repeated count, it would disappear. I called Diane and told her it might be more serious than I initially thought, that the test needed to be repeated, and that if she felt worse, we might have to move more quickly. When she pressed for the possibilities, I reluctantly opened the door to leukemia. Hearing the words seemed to make it exist. Not surprisingly, the repeated blood count was abnormal. I advised her to come into the hospital, explaining that we needed to do a bone marrow biopsy. She came into the hospital knowing what we would find. She was terrified, angry, and sad. Although we knew the odds, we both clung to the thread of possibility that it might be something else. The bone marrow confirmed leukemia. In the face of this tragedy, we look for signs of hope. In this area of medicine, in which technological interventions have been successful with cures of 25% of the time. Though doctors may argue over the exact percentages, they do not argue about the outcome of no treatment. Certain death in days, weeks, or at most a few months. Believing that delay was dangerous, our oncologist broke the news to Diane and began making plans to insert a Hickman catheter and began induction chemotherapy that afternoon. When I saw her shortly thereafter, she was enraged at this presumption that she wanted to be treated, and devastated by the finality of the diagnosis. All she wanted to do was to go home and be with her family. She had no other questions about treatment, and in fact had decided that she wanted none. Together we lamented her tragedy and the unfairness of life. Before she left, I felt the need to be sure that she and her husband understood that there was some risk in delay, that the problem was not going to go away, and that we needed to keep considering the options over the next several days. We agreed to meet in 2 days. She returned in 2 days with her husband and son. They had talked extensively about the problem and the options. She remained very clear about her wish not to undergo chemotherapy, and to live whatever time she had left outside the hospital. We arranged for home hospice care, although at that time Diane felt reasonably well, was active, and looked healthy. Left the door open for her to change her mind, and tried to anticipate how to keep her comfortable in the time she had left. Just as I was adjusting to her decision, she opened up another area that would touch me profoundly. It was extraordinarily important to Diane to maintain control of herself and her own dignity during the time remaining to her. When this was no longer possible, she clearly wanted to die. As a former director of a hospice program, I know how to use pain medications to keep patients comfortable and lessen suffering. I explained the philosophy of comfort care, which I strongly believe in. Although Diane understood and appreciated this, she had known of people lingering in what was called relative comfort, and she wanted no part of it. In our discussion, it became clear that preoccupation with her fear of a lingering death would interfere with Diane's getting the most out of life. I feared the effects of a violent death on her family, the consequences of an ineffectual suicide that would leave her lingering in precisely the state she dreaded so much, and the possibility that a family member would be forced to assist her, with all the legal and personal repercussions that would follow. She discussed this at length with her family. They believed that they would respect her choice. With this in mind, I told Diane that information was available from her Hemlock Society that might be helpful to her. A week later, she phoned me with a request for barbiturates for sleep. Since I knew that this was an essential ingredient in a Hemlock Society suicide, I asked her to come to the office to talk things over. She was more than willing to protect me by participating in superficial conversation about her insomnia, but it was important to me to know how she planned to use the drugs, and to be sure that she was not in despair or overwhelmed in any way that might colour her judgment. In her discussion, it was apparent that she was having trouble sleeping, but it was also evident that the security of having enough barbiturates available to commit suicide when, and if the time came, would leave her secure enough to live fully and concentrate on the present. It was clear that she was not despondent, and that, in fact, she was making deep personal connections with her family and close friends. I made sure she knew how to use the barbiturates for sleep, and also that she knew the amount needed to commit suicide. The next several months were very intense and important for Diane. Her son stayed home from college, and they were able to be with one another and say much that had not been said earlier. Her husband would stay at home so that he and Diana could spend more time together. She spent time with her closest friends. Bone pain, weakness, fatigue, and fevers began to dominate her life. Although the hospice workers, family members, and I tried our best to minimize the suffering and promote comfort, it was clear that the end was approaching. Diane's immediate future held what she had feared the most: increasing discomfort, dependency, and hard choices between pain and sedation. She called up her closest friends and asked them to come over to say goodbye, telling them that she would be leaving soon. As we had agreed, she had let me know as well. When we met, it was clear that she knew what she was doing, that she was sad and frightened to be leaving, but that she would be even more terrified to stay and suffer. In our tearful goodbye, she promised a reunion in the future at her favourite spot on the edge of Lake Geneva, with dragons swimming in the sunset. 2 days later, her husband called to say that Diane had died. She had said her final goodbyes to her husband and son that morning, and asked him to leave her alone for an hour. They had called me for advice on how to proceed. When I arrived at their house, Diane indeed seemed peaceful. Her husband and son were quiet. We talked about what a remarkable person she had been. They seemed to have no doubts about the course she had chosen or about their cooperation, although the unfairness of her illness and the finality of the death were overwhelming to all of us. I wonder how many families and physicians secretly helped patients over the edge into death in the face of such suffering. I wonder how many severely ill or dying patients secretly take their lives, dying alone in despair. I wonder why Diane, who gave so much to so many of us, had to be alone for her last hour of life. I wonder whether I will see Diane again, on the shore of Lake Geneva at sunset, with dragons swimming on the horizon. So just looking quickly at the extract. Dr. Quill is so convincing in his decision that one can momentarily waver thinking, is this not the humane way out for a sick person's terrible situation? But suddenly one shudders, thinking, is this not blasphemy against the Holy Spirit? Is this not a protest against the all-wise will of God, a protest against our source of life? Is it not accidental that the suicide promised to meet the doctor who helped her kill herself, where the dragons swim? Take note of how well this demonic trick is camouflaged. This type of medical assistance is now being more frequently reported in the press. Everyone is probably acquainted with Dr. Jack Kevorkian's invention called the suicide machine. The machine works on a simple principle. The incurably ill person who desires to put an end to his suffering plans out his end with Dr. Kevorkian. The doctor fills an intravenous bottle with poison and hooks it up to the patient. The patient himself pushes the button, which injects the poison and kills him. Dr. Quill and Kevorkian are in the front line of this blasphemous movement, but in general, the medical community is headed in that direction. The moving force behind all of this is finances. The fact is that because of the high cost of modern medical treatment, society cannot produce the funds necessary to treat all the critically ill over a long period of time. For example, the cost of medical care required for one person infected with AIDS is around $100,000 a year. Some cases of cancer are much more expensive. The numbers of ill people continually increase, but the means to cover the costs does not materialize. The government does not know where to acquire the funds. For the godless, the illogical solution to this dilemma is to restrict the span of the illness. This can be achieved by two means. The first way, though more radical and less widespread, is suicide, as in the cases cited above. The second, more realistic means is dealt with by every citizen of the United States. As of December 1st, 1991, a new law went into effect called the Patient Self-Determination Act of 1990. The law calls for every patient admitted to a hospital or rest home and receiving a government subsidy to be offered a document to sign called a living will or some similar document. These wills give the patient the possibility, while still in a sound state of mind, to determine the degree of medical attention he wants in order to prolong his life. The patient chooses from a series of levels of medical assistance. One extreme offers the patient all possible means available to prolong life. The opposite extreme is where the patient refuses all artificial assistance, including the most basic drugs, even nourishment. Between these two extremes are a series of degrees of assistance from which the patient chooses. As such, these wills are in themselves not negative. The Orthodox Christian may use them to determine his wishes at the end. For example, the patient can determine that the most essential point at the end of their life is a visit by a priest, receiving Holy Communion, and final spiritual guidance and prayer. What is troubling about these testaments is that they are motivated by money, and therefore the final outcome might be a choice of suicide. Only 3 months ago, a proposal was put to a vote in the state of Washington asking the electorate to decide whether to give doctors the medical right to kill the critically ill if they requested it. The proposal was not passed, but only by a slight margin. 47% of the state's voters decided to give doctors the possibility of killing their patients. This time, due to a 3% margin, the proposal was rejected, but most likely it will be accepted in the future. Ultimately, everyone will have the right to kill themselves with the help of the latest technological developments. God preserve us from this blasphemy and grant us a Christian ending to our life. The times are difficult and, according to many accounts, apocalyptic. The enemy of our race is increasing his onslaught and the flock is dwindling. But this time must be. Of course, in a short essay, it is impossible to discuss all the important moral questions of our times, but it's really not necessary to do so. It is clear from what has been discussed that the one repository of truth from whence it is possible to obtain answers to all of these complicated questions. The only source of the light of Christ is the Orthodox Church, the foundation of all our morality. Thus, the only path to a correct understanding of all moral questions concerning modern pastoral activity is a life in the Church. Some trust in chariots, and some in horses, but we will call upon the name of the Lord our God. Psalm 19, verse 7.